For 70 years, this was the place a child begged to be taken. Aisle after aisle stacked to the ceiling, bicycles hanging overhead, the smell of new plastic and cardboard. It was not a store so much as a destination. A warehouse built entirely around the idea that a kid, given enough choices, would never want to leave. At its height, it stood in nearly every large American town, 800 of them, each one a cathedral of childhood. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. Not because children stopped playing, not because the toys stopped selling. The shelves were still full when the lights went out. What killed this empire was not a competitor and not a change in taste. It was a number on a balance sheet, a debt the company was forced to carry, a debt it did not choose, a debt taken on by the very people who bought it. This is the story of how a healthy business was purchased with borrowed money, handed the bill, and slowly crushed under the weight of it. It is a story that has almost nothing to do with toys and almost everything to do with a single idea in modern finance: that a company can be made to pay for its own purchase, and that the people who arrange it can walk away richer, even as the company itself does not survive. The story begins in 1948 in a single shop selling furniture for babies. The founder noticed something simple. Parents came back for cribs and high chairs only a few times, but they came back for toys again and again. Toys broke. Toys were outgrown. Toys were the thing a child asked for on every birthday and every holiday. So he pivoted the whole business toward them, and he built it around a new kind of store, enormous, self-service, stacked high like a warehouse, with prices low enough that smaller shops could not follow. The industry would later give this model a name: the category killer. Pick one category, toys, and carry so much of it so cheaply in a space so large that no ordinary competitor could survive nearby. It worked almost too well. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the brand became the default, the first place a family thought of, and often the only place they needed. The local toy shop, the department store toy aisle, one by one. They could not match the selection or the price, and one by one, many of them closed. Being the default gave the company a second kind of power, quieter but just as important. It controlled the shelf that reached the most families in the country. For a toy maker, that shelf was oxygen. A product carried here could become a national phenomenon by the end of a single holiday season. A product denied space here often died in a warehouse, unseen. The company's buyers, in effect, helped decide which toys the country's children would even be offered. Suppliers planned their years around it. Entire product lines were designed to please it. By any normal measure, this was a strong company. It sold things people wanted, in volumes almost no one could match, backed by a name every parent and every child already knew. It had weaknesses, and it had rising competition on the horizon, but it was not sick. It was profitable. It was central. It was, in the language of business, a healthy-going concern. That distinction matters, because everything that came next was done to a company that was still standing firmly on its own 2 feet. Understand what dominance actually looked like from the inside. The company did not simply sell toys, it set the terms of the entire trade. Because it moved more product than anyone else, it could negotiate lower prices from manufacturers and pass just enough of that saving to shoppers to keep everyone else out. Its scale was a wall. A competitor would have needed to match the selection, match the price, and match the real estate. Hundreds of giant stores in prime locations, all at once, and almost no one could. For decades, this was the center of gravity in the toy world, and everything else arranged itself around it. Parents drove past smaller shops to get there because they knew it would have whatever the child had circled in the catalog. Manufacturers built their release calendars around its orders. Even the experience was engineered. The sheer overwhelming abundance of it, shelves taller than a parent, was itself the product. The promise was not just a toy. The promise was every toy, in one enormous room, cheaper than anywhere else. But that strength rested on a single physical assumption, that the best way to sell a toy was to put a child inside a giant room full of them. As long as that was true, the empire was safe. Its real vulnerability was never that people would stop buying toys. People would never stop buying toys. The vulnerability was subtler, that the ground beneath the model might shift, that a family might one day buy a toy without ever setting foot in a store, and that when that day came, the company would need money and freedom to change. Money to renovate stores that were beginning to age. Money to build a genuine presence online in the years when shopping was quietly migrating onto screens. Money to cut prices and hold the line against a new kind of giant. A company keeps that ability in 2 ways. It earns it, and it borrows carefully, always holding some room in reserve. A flexible business can absorb a shock and reinvent itself. A business that has already spent every ounce of its flexibility cannot. And in the middle of the 2000s, a single decision quietly took that flexibility away, not through any failure of the business, but through the way it was bought and sold. In 2005, three large investment firms bought the company together. The price was $6.6 billion. That figure on its own is not the problem. The problem is how it was paid. More than $5.3 billion of that price, roughly 80% of the total, was not the buyer's own money. It was debt. The buyers themselves contributed only about $1.3 billion of their own capital. To see why that detail decides everything, imagine buying a house. Normally, you take out the mortgage and you are responsible for paying it back. Now imagine a stranger buys the house but arranges for the mortgage to be placed in the house's own name so that the building itself somehow owes the loan and must pay it off out of the rent it earns, while the buyer holds the keys and owes almost nothing. That is, in plain terms, the mechanism of a leveraged buyout. The borrowed billions did not sit on the buyer's books. They were loaded onto the company that had just been purchased. The company did not receive that money to grow with. It received the obligation. From that moment on, it had to pay back billions of dollars, with interest year after year out of its own earnings that had once been free to reinvest. In effect, the company was made to borrow the money used to buy itself, and then handed the loan and told to pay. It had been strong the day before. The day after, it carried a mountain of debt it had never asked for and could never set down. And debt is not patient. By the time the crisis came to a head, the business owed around $5 billion, and it was spending roughly $400 million every single year just to pay the interest, not to reduce the debt, simply to keep it from growing. $400 million gone annually before a single dollar could be spent on anything that might secure the company's future. Think about what $400 million a year could have done in those exact years. It could have rebuilt tired stores into places families wanted to visit again. It could have funded a serious online operation at the precise moment shopping was moving onto the internet. It could have lowered prices to stay competitive with the largest retailers on earth. Instead, that money left the building every year and flowed to lenders. The company was not investing in its survival. It was renting it, one interest payment at a time, and the meter never stopped. The world then did exactly what the model had always feared. Families began buying toys online, delivered to the door, and buying them from enormous general retailers who could afford to sell toys at or even below cost, simply to pull shoppers through the door for everything else. To answer that, the company needed to modernize quickly and spend aggressively. It could do neither. Every dollar of flexibility had been mortgaged back in 2005. The debt did not merely weigh the company down. It removed the company's ability to fight back at the exact moment that fighting back was the only thing that mattered. In September of 2017, the business filed for bankruptcy protection. Even then, there was a version of events in which it survived, reorganized, lighter, freed of some of the debt, smaller but alive. For a few months, that was the plan, but confidence is fragile and it collapses fast. Suppliers grew nervous about being paid and began to pull back. Lenders lost patience. The holiday season that was supposed to prove the company could recover instead fell short, and the debt had left no cushion, no reserve, nothing to steady the fall. So in 2018, the decision came down. Not to shrink, but to close. All of it. Around 800 stores across the country were emptied, their shelves cleared, and their doors locked for the last time. Roughly 33,000 people lost their jobs, the workers who had stocked the aisles, run the registers, and assembled the bicycles that hung from the ceilings. A company that had taken 70 years to build was wound down in a matter of months. There is one more number, and it is the one that lingers. Over the years they owned the company, the three firms that had engineered the buyout collected an estimated $464 million in fees and interest. As tens of thousands of employees were told the stores were closing for good, the arrangement that had loaded the company with debt had already paid its architects handsomely. The workers left with severance fights and uncertainty. The financial engineering, by its own measure, had not entirely failed. That is the uncomfortable heart of the story. The deal could enrich the people who made it even as the company beneath it did not survive. And in a final, quiet coincidence, the man who had founded it all, who turned a single baby furniture shop into a toy empire 7 decades earlier, died in March of 2018, within days of the announcement that the American stores would be liquidated. He lived just long enough to watch the thing he built be taken apart. He did not preside over its failure. By every serious account, the business he created still knew perfectly well how to sell toys. It simply was no longer allowed to keep enough of the money it made to stay alive. It is tempting to file this under the familiar story, another old retailer that could not keep up with the internet. But that explanation is too easy, and it lets the real cause slip away unnoticed. The competition was real and it was fierce. Yet this company had faced fierce competition for decades and won. What it had never faced until 2005 was a debt so large that it could no longer afford to respond to anything at all. Amazon and the big box giants did not defeat a nimble, well-funded opponent. They arrived to find one whose hands had already been tied, years before the fight even began. This is the mechanism worth carrying away because it has repeated across many industries and many decades. A profitable company is bought using mostly borrowed money. The debt is placed not on the buyers but on the company itself. The company must then divert its earnings to service that debt instead of investing in its own future. When times are good, the arrangement can work, and the owners collect their fees and their returns. But when the business hits a storm, a new competitor, a shift in how people shop, a single bad season, it discovers it has no reserves left to weather it, because its flexibility was quietly spent on the day it was purchased. That is the trap. A strong business can be made fragile not by what it sells, but by how it is financed. The danger does not announce itself. For years, nothing looks wrong. The stores are open, the toys are selling, the name still means something. The weakness is invisible right up until the moment a shock arrives, and there is nothing in reserve to meet it. By then the choices are gone, spent long ago by people who no longer bear the cost. Notice, too, where the risk finally landed. The firms that arranged the purchase put in only a fraction of the price and placed the rest of the burden on the company. So when the storm came, it was not primarily their money at stake. They had already drawn out fees and interest along the way. The people who bore the full weight of the collapse were the ones who had no say in how the company was bought, the tens of thousands of employees, and the suppliers who had built their businesses around it. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. In a deal built this way, the reward and the risk are separated. One group collects the reward. A very different group, years later and often without ever understanding why, is left to absorb the risk. The debt was placed on the company, but the true cost was paid by the people inside it. The shelves were full. The name was known. The customers were still there. What ran out was not demand and not relevance. What ran out was room, the simple financial room to adapt, to spend, to fight. An empire that took 70 years to build was hollowed out in a little over a decade, not by a failure of its products, but by the weight of the debt used to acquire it. Sometimes a company is not beaten by the market at all. Sometimes it is simply buried under the price that someone else paid to own it. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It describes a lawful financial transaction and a corporate bankruptcy, and makes no allegation of criminal wrongdoing by any individual or company. All figures are drawn from publicly available reporting and financial filings, and source links are provided above.